Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'm delighted to see so many people here to have lunch and to listen to and think about and learn about the Canada-US relationship. That's a good thing. My name is Chris Reagan. I am an economist at McGill, and I am the director of the Max Bell School of Public Policy, and we are delighted to be hosting this event. But let me just begin by thanking Neil Rogachevsky in particular for being the mastermind behind the event and coordinating it and convincing people to come and talk and doing all of that hard work. So thank you very much for all of that. So we're building a brand new school of public policy at McGill, the Max Bell School, and I could talk at length about what it's all about, but we're not going to do that. Instead, let me say that there's two concepts, I think, that will be front and center in everything that the school does. One concept is the idea that public policy is very important, and it's more important than most people think. And the second concept is that public policy is complex. It's tough. There are very good reasons why an idea that looks so good on paper doesn't necessarily get adopted. And understanding that policy process and the complexity and the various complexities of the policy process is really important. And I think those two ideas, it is certainly our hope that those two ideas permeate everything we do, whether it's our teaching programs or our public events or our research. Let me just, for a moment, advertise briefly our flagship teaching program. You will have seen this brochure when you came in. Maybe there is one on the table in front of you. This is a brand new Master of Public Policy program. It will be starting this fall, and it is all about not just the importance of public policy, but in particular, the complexity of the policy process. And so if you are thinking about going back to school, if you are thinking about going on to school, if public policy interests you and you'd like to know more about it, then I invite you to check out our website, check out the program. You will find that the MPP program we have designed is like no other MPP program out there. We have looked very carefully at the leading MPP programs. We found their mistakes, and we worked hard to not replicate them. And quite honestly, you will find that it is a different program. And so take a look at it. It's all laid out in all of its gory detail on our website. And if you choose to apply for the next year, we're actually just in the process right now of finalizing the cohort, our inaugural cohort, to show up in August. So you're probably too late for that. But if you'd like to think about studying public policy in the future, please give us a call. Now, those ideas that policy is important and that getting good policy in place is a complex process and is difficult, there's no better example of those two ideas than the Canada-US relationship. The Canada-US relationship is important in many ways, and it is complex in many ways. You've got to really want it, you've got to think through it, and you've got to really work hard to make sure that that relationship is solid and is productive. And whether you're talking about trade or immigration or security or defense or anything else, that relationship is of paramount importance to Canada. So it's great that we're actually having this event on that topic. It's obviously an important topic, but it's a great illustration of those two concepts. So that's the end of my advertising. I'm going to now introduce the chair of our first panel, Neil Rogachevsky. He's a Tikva postdoctoral fellow at Yeshiva University in New York City. He's got a PhD in French history. I think you will find of all of the panelists today, he is probably the only one that's got a PhD in French history. I'm gonna go out on a limb. He may be the only one in the room that has a PhD in French history. And if you take a look at his bio, which I will not read, it is pretty much about French and history and military and pretty cool. So what is his connection to this discussion? Well, you will find that most of the people that are on the panelists today have a connection to Tom Velk. Tom Velk, who we will hear from later, Tom Velk is an institution at McGill University. I've been at McGill for a long time, actually. This is my 30th year. He's been here for like 3 times that length. Not quite. But he is an institution at McGill University, and most, if not all, of the panelists have been influenced by Tom Velk. They have had courses, and probably more than just influence through courses, influence through other discussions from Tom Velk. And Neil Rogachevsky is part of that mold. He did a BA from McGill University. He's currently a journalist and essayist. You may have read some of his things in The American Interest, The Atlantic, etc. So I'm going to turn this over right now to Neil, who's going to then introduce his panel, and we'll get this party started talking about past and present Canada-US issues. Neil.
Thank you, Chris Reagan, for that very kind introduction. It's great to see all of you here, and especially so many students as well. I know it's the end of April at McGill, and if memory serves, that means that there must be a beer tent open somewhere, so thanks very much for being here. It's a delight to moderate this first panel. Over the course of this afternoon, we will hear many arguments and opinions about the past, present, and future of North America. To get us started, however, we thought to spend a bit of time on the question of how to study North America. For it goes without saying, there are many approaches to the study of North America in the contemporary academy: geographic, religious, sociological, economic, historical, through its literature, from the study of political philosophy, to name some of the important ones. For the last half century, the study of North America through all these different lenses has flourished at McGill. This due in no small part to the leadership of Professor Tom Velk, who retires this year after over half a century at McGill. Through our discussion of Canada and the United States today, we honor his immense contribution to the intellectual life of McGill and his pioneering work in the study of North America. Along with the late historian Al Riggs, who some of us in the room also had the pleasure to know, Tom has directed North American studies from the early 1970s until his retirement this year. An economist by training and profession, Tom Velk is a thinker and teacher of extraordinary range and depth who, in his teaching and writing, has pointed beyond the disciplinary boundaries of the contemporary university, necessary as they may be, toward consideration of all the most fundamental questions. All of us on this panel have had the great good fortune to study, as well as at various times teach, North American studies with Tom Velk. I remember my first interaction with Tom Velk extremely vividly. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early September, and I had arrived for the first class in a seminar blandly titled Topics in North American Studies. Into the room, likely a few minutes late, came a bold, gregarious, friendly, dapper gentleman, suspenders, bow tie, less than a gently worn shirt with engraved initials on the wrist, TJV. But on this day, he also wore a t-shirt that had an F-15 fighter jet on it. Now, these days, I'm sure many McGill faculty wear such t-shirts, but in 2002, trust me, you didn't see that every day. Over the course of the year, Velk taught us the Federalist Papers, Alexis de Tocqueville, Mark Twain, Francis Trollope, and other classics of 19th century American literature. This was done with an unusual blend of wit, irreverence, theoretical insight, and real-world experience drawn from his work at the U.S. Federal Reserve and other high positions of government office that Tom had held in the United States before coming to McGill. Growing up in Toronto, I had very abstract and quite convoluted views about the United States. Bill Clinton impersonations on Saturday Night Live, the image of the Yankee in our high school history textbook tarring and feathering a poor United Empire loyalist, some vague impressions of financial capitalism, Hollywood, consumer culture. Studying with Velk was, for me, in many ways, the beginning of a true civic education, and his guidance and teaching in this area, has, for me and for many of his students, has opened us up to deeper understanding of America, Canada, and indeed Western civilization on the whole. My fellow panelists here have no doubt had similar experiences, so I'll just introduce them. So, at the far corner we have Todd Fox, who manages global government relations strategy at Visa. Todd was a Fulbright Fellow here at McGill in the early 2000s and taught North American Studies with Tom Velk. Dov Ziegler, now a fixed income strategist at Scotiabank in New York, studied economics and North American Studies at McGill, and later designed and taught a course in the program while working in finance in Montreal. Joanna Barron, to my left, now executive director of the Canadian Constitutional Foundation, took part in the North American Studies program as well. All of us are, as we like to say, villagers, alumni of the North American Studies program. So grateful to have studied with Tom. So the heading of our panel is Populism, Free Trade, and the Rule of Law. So what I'd like to do is toss up some general questions that involve this theme, but especially focus, I think, on what our panelists learned about these subjects and others, other enduring themes in North America through the teaching and example of Tom Velk. So as it happens, free trade, populism, and the rule of law are all Velkian themes. To kick us off, before I turn over to the panels, let me just say a few words about how Tom Velk has helped us think about these subjects, and I'll focus in particular on populism and the rule of law. So populism, this is a word, word or phenomenon is often portrayed in the press and learned expositions as simply opposed to the rule of law. Right, so populism on one hand, rule of law on the other. Right, perhaps in a more concrete treatment, you'll see populism on one side and opposed to the rule of experts and elites, what the philosopher Hegel called the rule of organized intelligence. No doubt, it's hard to deny, both in Canada and to some degree the United States, we're undergoing what can be described as a populist moment. In his teaching, however, Tom Velk has shown this is hardly a new phenomenon in the history of our two countries. One can think of names as diverse as William Jennings Bryan, Teddy Roosevelt, and William F. Buckley. Nor is populism always to be easily dismissed. If an existing elite is venal or simply misguided and shielded from the consequences of their actions by the fact of their having captured the main institutions of a country, popular outrage may be an effective tool at forcing constructive reforms upon the elite. Now, no one could convince Tom Velk of being a simple proponent of populism. In class and conversation, a favorite go-to of Velk has been Edmund Burke's account of the capitulation of the French elite in the face of revolutionary fervor in 1789. Quote Burke, "I thought 10,000 swords must have leaped from their scabbards to avenge even a look that threatened Marie Antoinette with insult. But the age of chivalry is gone, that of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded, and the glory of Europe is extinguished forever." Yet, according to Tom Velk, modern Anglo and American governments in particular have found a way both to include a role for populism in government while also channeling it. The separation of powers in American government between executive, legislative, and judicial branches remains perhaps the greatest example of this. Every branch of American government, we learn in the Federalist Papers, is fundamentally popular and Republican. Every branch is dependent on the people through voting in the case of the presidency and the Congress, and through the election of senators in the case of the judiciary. The senators then are in charge of confirming judges. But none of the institutions of a government are directly the people working by themselves. The prerogative, for instance, granted to the executive system, to the executive in the American system, is immense. The people only have the chance to say yay or nay every 4 years. This means the people must at once temper their expectations to decide directly key questions of state, but at the same time remain vigilant in defense of their interests. From the Velkian point of view, populism is, in a way, the fourth check in the US constitutional system, a necessary fourth check. And yet, and I think Velk would agree with me here, at the end of the day, how we judge populist sentiment at various moments fundamentally depends on what we think of the means that are employed and the ends are sought by the people. All right, that's much to get us started on the themes of populism and the rule of law. And just to emphasize, I think the interdisciplinary approach to the study of North America that Tom Velk has exemplified helps us get a bit beyond the treatment of these issues that appear in the popular press, and so on. All right, so I think I'll start with Todd Fox. Todd, you were a Fulbright Fellow at McGill in the early 2000s. You're now at Visa. Todd had spent time in the Treasury and Commerce departments. He's intimately involved in the renegotiation of and current trade agreements to Canada, U.S., and Mexico. So why don't you reflect on the theme and on Velk's teaching, if you could, for us.
Thank you, Neil, Tom, Mrs. Velk, Senator Frum. It's a pleasure to be here at this important event to commemorate the passing of the torch. I could not agree more with my colleague Neil's description of what Tom Velk has built as a village. And I also commend Dr. Reagan and the Max Bell School of Public Policy for taking this village and putting it on a global platform. And you've asked two very good questions. How can we do a better job of training practitioners in the importance of public policy and give people an appreciation for the complexity of public policy? And from my perspective, what McGill has done, what the study of North America at this institution has provided is a generation of practitioners with an opportunity to understand what it takes to be a player on the stage of public policy, to apply learning from the classroom to the world of international negotiations, to business, and to really create a positive feedback loop where students are returning, standing in front of the class that they once sat in, and share their knowledge, share their experiences. McGill may be unique among universities in the emphasis it places on experiential learning, and certainly my experience here, as Neil pointed out, was extraordinary because Professor Velk invited me to skip the student stage entirely and go right to teaching. I was 21 years old when I first debated Dr. Velk in front of a room of students that were essentially my peers. And it was an intimidating experience, but it taught me some important lessons that I think have really shaped the rest of my career up until this point. And I think that from my perspective, the study of North America is a great opportunity to understand that these traditions that Neil's describing, that begin with a battle of ideas about things like the rule of law and populism, from Spinoza to Burke to Hume to the Federalist to Mises and Friedman to F.A. Hayek to the scholars of the present day, many of whom are on the stage with me. The battle of ideas is not just about the ideas, it's about the battle. And what Professor Velk has always taught his students is to fight, to debate, but to disagree well, and to accept the feedback, to accept the disagreement as something that will actually make us all better at applying these lessons when it really counts. Following my time at McGill, I had the opportunity to represent the United States in trade negotiations with Canada and Mexico, later with China, and then to join the world of international business, where we apply lessons from the great philosophers in this great battle of ideas in a way that perhaps is more relevant than, with respect to the econometricians in the room, from the lessons of regression modeling and statistics. As important as those lessons may be, to understand what it takes to prevail in an argument against people who are motivated not only by economic theory, but by material self-interest, by national interest, and by a desire to win at your expense. It's increasingly important that we could reinforce these important skills of writing to persuade a popular audience, which in a world of populism grows more important by the day, to accept that we won't win every debate, but that we can live to fight another day, and to be open-minded and receptive to the feedback that comes from dialogue with people, even people that are supposed to be learning from you. can often become the teacher. And what I find most compelling about the year I spent at McGill and the subsequent opportunity to be a builder like Max Bell, like Tom Velk, like Brian Mulrooney, and other participants in this village has been the opportunity to participate in truly revolutionary times in shaping a policy agenda that will actually bring greater prosperity and greater security to all of us. So, Tom, I thank you for that. Dr. Reagan, I salute you for taking this on. And with that, I hand it back to Neil.
Dov Ziegler, do you want to jump in there?
Well, sure. And I think that I first would like to thank everyone here for joining us in our conference. I'd like to thank Neil Rogachevsky for moderating, my fellow panelists for being here. I'd like to thank Professor Velk, his family, Senator Frum, and Professor Reagan as well for helping put together, I think, an important debate all day about Canada and U.S. relations. And it's a subject that we hear about all the time. We read all sorts of public policy discourse about it as people here at a university at an event hosted by a public policy school. It's in the newspapers, it's on television, and it's very easy for us to get very carried away with our own political predilections when we think about these issues, because they're political issues. There's no question that people have strong disagreement about trade, what's the right trade policy, about populism, should we rely on the people, should we rely on experts to make decisions about any number of important factors in government. And the rule of law, well, what is the rule of law? Who decides the laws? Who decides how to interpret the laws? All questions that really exceed the simple news of the day, and yet about which it's very easy to get carried away when considering the news of the day. And so if there's one overarching way that I think probably it's fair to say all four people on this panel think about these issues. After all, Mr. Rogachevsky did ask us to think about how to think about these issues. If there's one overarching way that we would all want to think about these issues, it would be in light of a perspective that exceeds whatever we're worried about at any given moment. It would be to think about this in light of first principles. And if there's one great thing that I think anyone who wants to approach public policy thinking can do, it's to make sure that before they get extremely detailed and get right down to the bottom of the issue that they are looking into, they have recourse to first principles. And that is one of the great things that I think all of us learned essentially in seminars taught by Professor Velk. Now, interestingly, we didn't learn per se Tom Velk's first principles. We just got books. He gave us books and books and books. I'll never forget that as a second-year student, I went to see Professor Velk. And I just finished an internship over the course of that summer. I had taken his Introduction to Political Economy class the year before. I had learned a great deal about these principles there, but I won't get into the boring details. Instead, I'll tell the story. And I asked him, Professor Velk, what courses should I take this year? And I was expecting to get a long, extended discourse on the nature of education, the right kind of courses a student should take. And before we got into that, he said, I've got to give you some advice. I've got to give you some very important advice. Never buy a Porsche on eBay. Now, this might seem trite, but the next sentence was, and you should take my graduate level course in North American Studies, which I did. And the reading for the first week was both volumes of Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville. A light amount of reading. And I was very worried because I had not taken any 500 level courses at that stage. I had taken the normal smattering of courses that one ought to take in their first year. I had managed to avoid taking any of the math or economics courses I was supposed to take because at the time they had some tests that you could take and pass out of those courses. So I'd just done whatever I'd wanted to. And then here I was in my second year taking this 500 level course. And I was very worried, who will show up in this course? The answer, of course, was Professor Velk and his intimidating fellow professor, Todd, who at the time was a 22-year-old Fulbright fellow at McGill University. But notwithstanding some of the ironies and jokes that I just sort of laid out, there actually is a meaningful aspect to this way of thinking about studying public policy. And that is that you start with first principles and you read great books. And we didn't really learn those first principles, as I said, from Professor Velk. We learned them from the books. And the reading kept on coming, fast and furious. Next, the Federalist Papers. After that, pretty much everything that Mark Twain ever wrote. And we had to know it essentially off by heart if we wanted to do a really good job. That was one of the amazing things that we were all able to avail ourselves of. And then I think now about these questions on our panel. Populism. Is there a better way to understand the character of American populism than through the literature of Mark Twain? I would contest probably not. You can't learn about the spirit of independence of the American population, the principles that underlie the idea that each person themselves, with no recourse to any education or outside expertise, knows what to do, than by reading the stories of children, right, of Huck Finn, who always thinks he knows what to do. It's a literary mirror for the concept that expertise can only be filtered through the prudent judgment of the individual. An important first principle in thinking about the question of expertise that Neil laid out. The question of the rule of law. Well, who better, or what source is better to turn to than the Federalist Papers, which, by the way, do not elaborate the laws. They elaborate the rationale for the laws, the reasons for the laws, not what's in the Constitution, but why we should have the Constitution. Very important questions, questions that exceed literal legalism, something which I won't talk further about because we have Canada's expert on that subject sitting right beside me. Another important subject that, of course, came up is free trade. Free trade is something that we think of technocratically, and rightly so. You're speaking to a couple of practitioners in the field here. Todd negotiates aspects of trade deals amongst countries and the details that pertain to it. I deal in bonds, another subject that's very intimately tied to global trade and free trade. However, before you consult all of the data that one needs to consult in order to analyze these sort of things, you also need to have first principles about what trade and commercial relations and free trade even means. What is free trade? A subject that I think we all take for granted. We assume it means the thing that we discuss when we're examining our textbooks, and we hypothesize that it would be optimal for different countries to have optimized exchange of their goods, et cetera, but we don't necessarily read David Hume, and who is really the author, actually, even before Adam Smith, of most of the concepts that we employ in considering money and trade. Professor Velk, of course, I think after my second year, told me that my next assignment over the summer was to help him write a series of essays for the International Hume Society about Alexander Hamilton's use of David Hume's concepts regarding free trade. So I think that before we have now that we'll soon be launching into our discussion of the subject and my time, I think, is probably up to give my preface. It's been a long preamble. Before we discuss these topics, I want to lay down the gauntlet that says we should think about first principles when we talk about populism and free trade and the rule of law.
Thank you very much. Joanna Barron, do you want to, how have first principles influenced, how much do you think about first principles in the course of your work in the law in Canada and legal education in Canada?
Well, before I answer that question, I'll have a preamble of my own. So to talk about how I came to study with Professor Velk, so I had met Dov and Neil in a philosophy seminar. We were all very interested in philosophy and the history of philosophy, and they said, next year you absolutely have to take Professor Velk's 500-level seminar, the same one with both volumes of Democracy in America. And I said, but I'm not interested in economics. I'm interested in, Plato and humanities. So it doesn't matter. The main thing is that Tom is a great person and he'll be a good friend. So I was curious enough to show up. I got the syllabus. I thought it was a joke. I thought it was hilarious. All of these volumes of Democracy in America and many other exotic things thereupon. But I would say, and the one thing that Dov touched on a bit is the sort of, for me, Tom was the first and probably the best interdisciplinarian that I've encountered. Normally that's an insult in academia, but for Tom, studying economics is meaningless outside of the sort of colored context of Democracy in America in the sense of bringing out these exceptionalities of American character and American disposition. And you can't understand debates that are still very much occupy our media discourse over the role of immigration and multiculturalism without knowing that these debates have been going on since Jacob Riis's photographs of various immigrant groups in America and much before that. And so I think Tom has given us that, and that in conjunction with the appreciation for first principles. But also the one point that hasn't been brought up that I think is most important is the lessons of character that I really learned from Tom. Dov really hit the nail on the head when said it's just a human being that you should learn from. And Tom has really taught me how to build community, how to build intellectual communities, how to build communities of thought, and how to be a good friend. And so thank you very much.
Great. All right. So you mentioned American exceptionalism as a key thing to consider in the question of North America, and this has been an ongoing trope in American politics for the last couple of decades. This is it's always been there in a way, but it's been rejuvenated. So I'm wondering if someone wanted to jump into that. The question of how thinking about American exceptionalism, how is that impact your way of thinking about relations between Canada and the United States? Someone want to take American exceptionalism?
Well, we do live. Neil's question leads us somewhere obvious. We live in the era of, for better or for worse, the phrase "America first" being a phrase that appears on every newspaper, and we have to weigh it and debate it. And we all have feelings about it. I'd imagine we're sitting here in Montreal at a university at McGill. We don't feel great about it. But then we ask ourselves, is there a more profound question than this question of what we see in the newspapers? And that would be the concept of American exceptionalism. And the concept of American exceptionalism has nothing to do with anything that we really see in front of us on a daily basis. It has to do with the words of the Federalist Papers. Is it the case that we can create an experiment in government which will attempt to instantiate in a country the principles of right government? Can we have a country whose leadership is not appointed because of its hereditary quality or because of its controlling national resources, but rather whose leadership is appointed by a system of government that is organized to balance the interests of the entire country and ensure that the rights of all the citizens are held sacrosanct? And that is actually what I think of when I hear American exceptionalism. I think of the Federalist Papers.
One of the things that always struck me about 1776 is the fact that we were kind of simultaneously living through two great revolutions, the political revolution and the industrial revolution. And it's in times of change when the matters of how our laws and the not the natural laws, not the first principles, but the administrative regulations that govern commerce, which is where I've spent most of my career, but also the political laws, the Constitution that we live under, whether it's the Canadian or the U.S. or other countries where there are constitutional forms of government that have the effect of sort of ordering our society and our intercourse and our affairs. We're living right now through what I think you can call the fourth industrial revolution, and living as I do, kind of close to Silicon Valley and being a participant in a lot of the innovation that's kind of forcing a new conversation about how our systems of government and our administrative state are trying, in some cases succeeding, in many cases not, in keeping pace with the innovations that are really transforming commerce. And it raises a lot of very interesting questions. Again, the complexity and the importance of public policy for business is increasingly relevant. And the question of whether one regime is exceptional, I think really will be decided with every revolution. My view is that we need to continue to focus on training practitioners that have an appreciation of both sides of this coin. And I think the first principles thinking actually is really the North Star that will help these practitioners navigate these changes.
And do you think the changes that need to be conducted are on the level, they're in the level of administration, or do we need rethinking of the basic constitutional framework in the United States? I mean, clearly, you refer to first principles, which you are implying that those are in a way self-evident. They're always true and they're always applicable. At what level? I mean,
I think the question is, why is so much of the fourth industrial revolution being driven out of one zip code in the United States, out of a few neighborhoods in coastal China? Why is this not evenly distributed across the globe? And I think this is the real test of a regime, or one of the tests is, does it produce the circumstances to revolutionize the way we live? So, for example, despite the fact that Silicon Valley, I might say Wall Street, with the joint stock company being kind of the precursor to the first industrial revolution, but continuing to play a role in the present revolution, has so transformed economic life for the rest of the world. It's an open question whether it is necessary for harmonization of regimes across different countries. So, for example, what's driving populism in the United States? A perception that the middle class is shrinking, that inequality is rising. At Visa, we look at this data very carefully, and what we've found is, in fact, 2016, 2017 was a peak in the use of physical cash, and now we are seeing more transactions in digital form. That allows us to do some interesting analysis and see what's happening with consumption globally. That leads us to look at what is the actual balance of people living in poverty versus people that are living in the middle class, people that are prospering, people that are rising out of poverty. And what we've seen is a lot of these technologies, although often maligned, are pulling people out of poverty at an amazing rate. So 2018, specifically September of 2018, was the tipping point. Now, more than 50% of the world's population are middle class. If you want to talk about the culmination of all the economics that we've all studied over the years, that was the point that we were aiming for, to reach a tipping point where the vast majority of the world's population is not in abject poverty. And we've reached that point, and it went almost unnoticed and uncelebrated. Our chief economist at Visa projects that by 2030, 2/3 of the world's population will be middle class. Where will they live? Probably in cities, probably in Asian cities, probably in the emerging markets, probably in the capitals of Africa, probably in places where the demographic pyramid is working in favor of sustained economic growth. And I do think that will cause a new sort of thinking about the question of American exceptionalism. Are the countries that will be the real sort of growth engines of the next 100 years be the countries in which there's an enabling environment to sustain this pace of innovation, or will things taper off? It's an open question, and I think we all have a strong interest in making sure that it does not.
Dov, you want to jump in on that as well, or?
Well, I'd actually want to ask, you mentioned the legal side of things too. You said that we have this question of whether or not our constitutional forms require renewal. That's a really big question if you think about it. That's a question that asks whether or not the crises that we feel as though we might be experiencing are caused by economic upheaval, as Todd points out, and whether or not that economic upheaval demands some kind of big legal change. Now, I wonder what you think about that, Joanna. I mean, you're an expert on this. What do you think about the ways in which our laws are being contested, our constitutional orders being contested?
Well, people ask me a lot. I now direct the Canadian Constitution Foundation, but I started a national law student organization called the Runnymede Society that has debates and sort of comes at the question of the study of law from an individual liberty paradigm. And people ask me frequently about the comparison between the Runnymede Society and the Federalist Society in the United States. And when I thought about it, and of course Federalist Society really nurtured a lot of scholarship on a interpretive approach called originalism, which is sort of self-explanatory. The text of the law predominates, original public meaning, that is how the law should be applied, not, and it's juxtaposed with progressive constitutional interpretation, which is really the only interpretive approach I learned as a law student here at up the hill at McGill Law on Peel Street. And when I thought about it, it's really is for me the most vivid example of American exceptionalism, because we don't have in Canada this quasi-biblical moment where the Constitution is given, it creates this propositional nation, and you really understand why constitutional politics have a quasi-religious tone in the United States, because for all intents and purposes, they are religious. And so for me, it's, there are benefits to talking about textualism and judicial incrementalism in Canada, but no, we're not going to have a Canadian constitutional originalism. It simply doesn't work. We have the charter, we know what happened in 1982, Pierre Trudeau had some meetings, and so on and so forth. But when I think about American genius, I think about this. It's the only nation I know of that really was, in a concrete sense, fought and born on ideas.
Great. All right. What can we do here? So there in the course of this discussion, many names of great thinkers have come up, and many of them, Tom Velk has devoted his life to studying and elucidating. So I want to mention a couple of names and see how that has influenced our fellow panelists in their work and their study. So Dov, you mentioned David Hume. I want to maybe put that name out there, and you could say a few words about Hume and the Humean approach to economic policy. How does that impact your thinking on economic questions today?
I'll play a fun game. I'll answer with just essentially one word or phrase. So David Hume, that big idea was a plan that is no plan. His idea was that human liberty unleashed was the only plan, and we would have to come up with the rest.
Interesting. All right.
Indeed, so much so that you have to create your identity every day when you wake up, according to Hume. So
yeah,
it's definitely human progress is up in the air.
Yes, your imagination's supposed to be all that exists, according to him. So that's a big one.
What about Alexander Hamilton, another favorite of Professor Velk?
Todd, you want to do Hamilton?
Todd, could you rap a bit on that?
I regret every day not being the one that came up with the idea to write Hamilton the musical.
Todd was also a rapper in his days.
So. Quite good one.
Good one.
And a Hamiltonian one.
A Hamiltonian one.
I think Hamilton is the quintessential version of a person that lives up to this concept that we've been describing, of a person that's as comfortable in the battle of ideas as in the actual physical revolution, and then the author of the world's most important policy white paper.
Very good. All right, I think I'll stop there, and we can open it up to questions, comments, and can have your say.
If no one has a question for us, I have a question for Neil.
Yes, please. Okay.
I've steered the conversation into this theory of revolution, and you're the great expert on revolutions of continental Europe. I wonder if you could speak about what we can learn from France in particular, but continental philosophy and its applications to North America.
Right. Well, it's a hard one. To answer that question, I think I'll refer to a favorite book by one of Tom's favorite books, The Roads to Modernity, by Gertrude Himmelfarb, which sketches various paths that countries have taken to over the course of the Enlightenment to achieve their constitutional settlements. And looking at the case of France, what Himmelfarb argues in that work, the overemphasis on Enlightenment principles untempered by an understanding of situation, of context, of history, set on a course of course there are successful moments and France from 1789 till the present. Not an extreme critic of all French government, but at its founding, this emphasis, you could say, extreme Enlightenment emphasis on principles at the expense of, you could say, prudential judgment or whatever, could cause all kinds of extreme political havoc, right? So what I would say is, I think the lesson is we're not, I think, I personally happen to believe that, the principles expressed in you could say, for Enlightenment philosophy, the self-evident truths of all men are created equal, they're endowed by their Creator, with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness are true. However, it's and certainly we've had examples of this in recent years. Also, it's not simply a matter of understanding the principles and then simply applying them regardless of understanding of context, situation, circumstance, right? One has to be alive to facts on the ground, circumstances, and so on, right? And I think we've all, in recent years, we've had examples of this, right? The necessity of considering circumstance, right? And the need to blend both principle and situation. But there's no formula about how you actually do that.
And maybe one thing I'd want to add is that the United States might have been born amidst a kind of revolution. However, I think everyone would agree that it was a very incremental revolution. It instantiated it took the principles of British law under which the British American colonists were living in the 13 colonies and instituted them into a more robust and rigorous framework for government, and did so and created that through, of course, an armed conflict which wrested those colonies free from the British Empire in order to live under those principles more purely articulated. Since then, however, of course, there have been industrial revolutions, but there haven't been revolutions in government. Government has adopted, changed in increments in the United States, but it hasn't had a revolution, nor has really what was the British Empire, now called the United Kingdom, had revolutions. But of course, even in the last century, Europe, we don't think of them this way, but it has indeed had any number of revolutions. I mean, the regimes of large states in Europe have changed their form of government from democratic to totalitarian to back to being democratic. It's changed their forms of election from representative to proportional representation. There have been any number of major revolutions to deal with changing economic facts. And so here we are at this moment of great tumult in the United States, and to a much lesser extent, thankfully, in Canada. And we wonder whether or not we're living amidst a revolution, or if we're, in fact, following this tradition of organic change or within the rubric of the existing constitutional framework. And I think we could all be glad that when we see industrial upheaval, the kinds of which you've pointed to, a fourth industrial revolution with concomitant economic consequences, the way it's dealt with is using the forms of American government and not efforts to change American government. In Canada, all the more so, with its even longer and unbroken chain of government, if not constitutional, then under the rubric of common law.
But proposals such as, this is debated in various forms in the United States and Canada. In the United States, a proposal which is gaining some steam to abolish the Electoral College on one hand. In Canada, proposals to bring in proportional representation as opposed to first past the post. How, if these were implemented, how drastic of a change would these be to the constitutional settlement? Would that count as something that's part of the incremental reform, par for the course of in the history of Anglo-American government, or would this represent something close to a revolutionary or decisive change? Joanna.
I was opposed to the change to proportional representation. I do think that that rumors of its revolutionary effect are much exaggerated because, again, we have to look at national disposition and things like that. It simply wouldn't be the country wouldn't work without parties that sought some type of, federal consensus and so on. I guess that's all I have to say on that.
I would want to echo what Joanna said and go a bit further even. What I would say is that proportional representation misses the point of what elections are for. There are really two different concepts of election and voting. One of them is the Lockean one. We elect the one that's best articulated in the Federalist Papers. We elect representatives so that we can know who's governing, and we have votes so we can kick them out if they do a bad job governing. Proportional representation follows the Rousseauian concept of elections. We elect people in order to embody our general will. And so these are actually two drastically different concepts of government. One of them says the government exists to do, or voting happens so that the representatives can do what the people say. And then a district system says that each district has a magistrate that it puts into the government. The magistrate will do what the magistrate thinks is in the public interest, and if it's not in the public interest, the public has recourse to sack the magistrate. And so I think they're two totally different methods of election with two totally different concepts of why we vote and what the people are there for. Neil at the beginning, or Dr. Rogachevsky at the beginning said that there's something that is that there's the populace is in a way a check on government. That it is a fourth branch of government, a check on government, and I think that's a very profound insight. In a system of proportional representation, though, it would not hold. In a system of proportional representation, the concept is that the populace, rather than being a check on government, is embodied in the government by the elected magistrate.
No?
Question from Professor Velk?
Well, I wanted to say something about Gertrude Himmelfarb's book. It's one of the great books, I think, and the notion of the French, who are such a contrast to the Americans in the way they think about things. And the line I'd like to take is to point out that and I'm going to rant on about American exceptionalism in my own piece later on, but there's a I don't need it. The day comes I can't fill a room like this with Oh, you're recording. Oh, all right. Okay. Then I'll do it. But it'll be a cold day in hell when I can't fill a room like this with my sometimes unwelcome thoughts. What Tocqueville points out, of course, is that the American idea is not necessarily a particularly good one, as in contrast to the continental ideas about good government, but it's the inevitable one. And he also goes on to make the point that when the American version of democracy takes over the world, there will be a great loss, and it'll be kind of a French loss. It'll be a loss of excellence and refinement and subtlety, and the cathedral burned the other day. But the notion that you go to the king and you say, well, we want to build a cathedral, Your Highness, and how long is it going to take? Oh, I don't know, 300 years, 400 years, something like that. No problem, go ahead, you do it. That's what you can do in France. And you can defend the grandeur. It's the French idea, grandeur, it's even a French word, I guess. Tocqueville says then is that it's not all great that you get the rest of the world, the American model of democracy. You're going to lose excellence, refinement, subtlety, and that's a real tragedy. But as good old Francis Parkman has to say about the same thing, what you get is the lank, lean body, all head. That's Francis Parkman on France, and you lose that. And what you get is the headless body full of muscle and blood, which is the American model. It's simple, it's broad-based, it's populist, whether at the end of the day that version, that kind of American exceptional notion of what the good society is, like a society that's good for the common man, may not be good for the Rousseaus, for the Humes, for the Mozarts, because who's going to pay for them, right? Who's going to build those cathedrals? Nobody builds any cathedrals. We have, hotels instead, and that's a loss to. When we think of what is important about Western civilization, an awful lot of it comes from that other tradition. Those cathedrals, Mozart, the idea of thinking, the idea of a community of sophisticates like us, right? If they had their way out there in the streets, they long ago, they maybe at least at a minimum pay no attention to us. So it's not always a good thing that we lost that French continentalist vision of what a good society is. But it lasts I don't know. It didn't have the strength. It was a lank, lean body, says Parkman. And the muscly body knocked it down.
Lovely. All right. So I think we'll stop there. Thank you very much for our fellow panelists, and we'll move on to our second panel, which will be a much more public policy oriented panel. Thank you.